The air was heavy with silence, yet the silence felt louder than thunder. Sophie's small hands trembled as the echo of her mother's scream tore through the walls, ripping away the fragile safety of her childhood. A voice cracked with grief, breaking apart like glass against stone. The words carried a finality that Sophie's heart could not bear. Her world, once filled with innocence, was no longer hers. Shadows stretched across the room, swallowing the light that once belonged to laughter. The reality pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She stared into the empty space where joy had lived, and in that moment she felt something break inside her forever. She wanted to cry, to scream, but no sound came out. The weight of despair turned her into stone. The truth was merciless, stripping away everything tender, and leaving only pain. Sophie's childhood ended not with a whisper, but with a scream that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The silence that followed felt unbearable, as though the house itself had been robbed of air. Sophie's small chest rose in shallow breaths, her body stiff with fear she couldn't understand. She stared at the cracks in the floorboards, counting them as if numbers could anchor her to a safer world. Every creak of the house felt like a scream waiting to break loose again. She wanted to run, yet her feet felt chained to the ground. Shadows flickered across the walls, and each shape seemed alive, waiting to swallow her whole. The voices that once sang lullabies now felt like distant ghosts. She tried to whisper a prayer, but no words formed. Instead, she clenched her tiny fists, nails pressing into her palms, as if the pain could keep her awake in this nightmare. For the first time, Sophie understood what it meant to be alone, even in a room filled with people. The walls seemed to lean in closer, suffocating Sophie with a weight that words could not explain. She reached for her stuffed rabbit, gripping it as if it were the last piece of comfort left in the world. Her eyes wandered to the tilted family photographs, smiling faces frozen in time, mocking the shattered present. She wanted to ask why everything had broken, why the love she believed unshakable had vanished in screams and silence. The air tasted bitter, as though sorrow itself had settled into her lungs. Her small body trembled under the weight of questions she couldn't voice. Every heartbeat was a drum of fear, and every second stretched into an eternity of dread. She pressed her cheek against the cold wall, searching for something solid to hold her together. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, each one sharp as a knife, making her flinch with every strike. Her mind painted terrifying images of doors slamming, of love leaving forever, of her world unraveling beyond repair. She wanted to scream for them to stop, to beg for them to stay, but her lips refused to part. She curled into herself as if becoming smaller might make her invisible to the storm. Each breath came uneven, caught between sobs that never fully formed. She wondered if the silence that followed meant the end or a beginning she did not want. The night outside pressed against the windows, as though darkness itself had come to witness her pain. Sophie lifted her head slightly, eyes red and swollen, staring into the void beyond the glass. She searched for stars, for something constant and beautiful. But clouds swallowed the sky whole. A whisper inside her begged for the world to pause, to rewind, to take her back to the moments when her home was filled with warmth. She touched the glass with trembling fingers, the cold surface biting her skin. She realized then that nothing would ever be the same. A part of her had been taken, leaving only an emptiness that no hug could heal. And as her tears fell, she accepted that her childhood had ended with a scream that would echo forever. The morning light crept through thin curtains, but it felt colder than night. Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the patterns on her blanket, as though they held answers. She wanted to believe everything was fine, that yesterday's screams were just a dream, but the silence in the house told her otherwise. The smell of coffee drifted faintly from the kitchen, but it carried no warmth. Each sound, the clink of a spoon, the rustle of paper, reminded her of how far her world had shifted. She tried to recall her mother's laugh, her father's gentle tone, but the memories felt like they belonged to someone else's life. Sophie's chest tightened as though her heart refused to beat the same way it had before. She longed for someone to hold her, to tell her she was safe, yet deep inside, she knew safety had slipped away. Childhood was slipping too, piece by fragile piece. She wandered into the kitchen, her small steps echoing in the quiet. The table was set, but the air felt heavy with unspoken words. Her mother stood by the stove, her shoulders slouched as if carrying the weight of the world. Sophie watched her stir the pot without speaking, each motion slower than the last. She wanted to ask if things would be okay, but her lips refused to move. The silence stretched between them like an invisible wall, stronger than any brick or stone. Sophie's eyes searched for comfort in her mother's face, but what she found instead was exhaustion, eyes rimmed red from nights of tears. For the first time, Sophie saw her mother not as invincible, but as human, broken, fragile, and hurting. The ticking clock on the wall became louder than her thoughts, each second stretching into eternity. Sophie sat at the table, her fingers tracing circles on the wooden surface. Across from her, her father sat silently, eyes fixed on a newspaper he wasn't reading. His jaw tightened with every breath, as though speaking would shatter him completely. Sophie wanted to bridge the silence, to ask if he still loved them, but fear held her still. She felt like a guest in her own home, watching two strangers who once had been her world. Every moment at that table was a reminder of how quickly love could vanish, leaving only shadows in its place. Sophie's eyes flicked toward the window, where the world outside carried on as if nothing had changed. Children's laughter floated faintly from the street, the sound both comforting and cruel. She imagined joining them, running free, forgetting everything locked inside this house. But her body stayed anchored to the chair, as though invisible ropes tied her down. She pressed her hands against her chest, trying to hold together the pieces that threatened to fall apart. She wondered why the world could shine outside while her world had gone dark. For the first time, she felt the weight of separation, not just between her parents, but inside herself. Her mother finally placed a plate in front of her, but Sophie couldn't lift the fork. The food looked the same as every other morning, but nothing tasted the same anymore. Her throat tightened and her stomach twisted with unease. Her mother forced a smile, but it was thin, fragile, like glass about to break. Her father cleared his throat, but no words came out. Sophie looked at them both, the people who were supposed to be her anchors, and felt adrift. She lowered her gaze, whispering to herself that maybe she didn't need answers, just a moment where the world didn't hurt so much. But even that small hope felt impossible. The house no longer felt like home. It had become a battlefield where silence was sharper than any blade. Sophie sat on the stairs, knees pressed to her chest, listening to muffled voices from behind closed doors. Each word slipped through the cracks like smoke, curling into her heart, stinging her more than fire. She pressed her palms against her ears, but the sound found her anyway. Her heart pounded, waiting for the inevitable. Raised voices, accusations, the storm she feared, but could never stop. She whispered to herself, asking why love had to sound like war. Her small voice vanished in the thunder of arguments, swallowed whole by the shadows of her home. Her father's voice thundered through the hall, low but sharp, like a blade slicing the air. Her mother's reply followed, broken and trembling, each word crashing like shattered glass. Sophie's chest grew heavy with every exchange, her body shrinking into itself. She wanted to run to them to beg them to stop, but her legs refused to move. The walls seemed to shake with their anger, and Sophie realized no one could protect her from this. Love, the thing she had trusted most, had turned into a weapon. She buried her face in her arms, wishing she could disappear into the cracks of the stairs. The argument spilled into the living room, louder, crueler, impossible to ignore. Sophie followed slowly, feet dragging as though chained. Her mother stood with tears streaking down her face, her father with eyes hard as stone. They spoke in half-shouted words, each one carving deeper into the air. Sophie froze at the doorway, a ghost in her own home, unseen by the people she needed most. She clenched her fists, nails biting into her palms, as if pain could stop her from falling apart. The weight of their anger pressed against her chest until she could barely breathe. Her mother's voice cracked as she begged for peace, while her father turned away, jaw tight, eyes burning with unspoken fury. Sophie stepped forward, but the words caught in her throat, vanishing before they reached air. She wanted to scream for them to see her, to notice her trembling body, but they were locked in a war that left no room for her. She felt like glass, transparent, fragile, and ready to shatter at the slightest touch. For the first time, she wondered if she mattered at all in their world of hurt. The shouting finally stopped, leaving a silence more frightening than noise. Sophie stood frozen in the center of the room, her stuffed rabbit dangling from her hand. Her mother's face was pale, drained, her father's eyes dark and distant. Sophie realized then that nothing she could say would mend what had broken. She turned slowly, retreating back toward her room, each step echoing in the hollow house. Tears slid down her cheeks, warm trails of a pain too big for a child to hold. In that moment, Sophie understood that her world was no longer safe. Childhood had slipped from her grasp, leaving her with only sorrow and fear. The night was heavy, silence thick enough to crush her chest. Sophie lingered at the edge of the hall, shadows swallowing her small frame. Her parents' voices returned, low at first, then sharp, slicing through the air. This time, it wasn't about small things, but the truth, the unbearable truth, that her father was leaving, not for work, not for distance, but for someone else. The words landed like stones, each one striking Sophie's fragile world, tearing down what was left of her trust. She clutched the doorframe, her fingers trembling against the wood, breath shallow, as though the very air had betrayed her. She felt the walls closing in, her heart breaking in ways a child's heart should never know. Her mother's voice cracked, shaking with fury and despair. She demanded answers, demanded to know why promises were broken, why loyalty had crumbled. Her father's silence was louder than any confession, his eyes avoiding hers, heavy with guilt. Sophie's breath caught, her small body rigid, her world collapsing. She wanted to believe it wasn't real, that it was a nightmare she could wake from, but the bitterness in the room made it all too real. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the words clawed through, sharp and merciless. Trust was shattered, and innocence was gone. The words that escaped her mother's lips carried the weight of betrayal. Sophie heard it all, the name of another woman, the truth that cracked her family's foundation. Her father's silence confirmed everything. Sophie's heart hammered in her chest, each beat a scream she couldn't release. She backed away from the door, small steps retreating into darkness. The walls no longer felt like walls, they felt like cages, closing in with every breath. She realized then that her family wasn't broken by chance, it was torn apart by choice. The truth was sharper than glass, and it cut deep. Her mother collapsed onto the couch, hands trembling as she buried her face. Her father stood by the window, his figure rigid, back turned, a silhouette of guilt. Sophie's eyes darted between them, searching for something, anything to hold on to, but there was nothing left. Love had been gutted by betrayal. She stepped further into the room, but no one noticed. Her small voice whispered questions only the walls could hear. Why? How? And what now? The silence that followed was not peace. It was finality. The fracture was no longer hidden. The air was suffocating, heavy with truths too big for a child to bear. Sophie turned slowly, her stuffed rabbit dragging against the floor, its worn fabric collecting dust. She walked back toward her room, her steps slow, as if each one carried the weight of 1,000 heartbreaks. Behind her the voices quieted, but the silence was worse. She reached her bed, pulling the blanket over her small frame, curling into herself as though she could vanish. Her heart whispered for safety, but all she found was emptiness. The truth had destroyed her world, and nothing would ever bring it back. Thorn had moved beyond whispers and shadows. It was here, violent and unrelenting. Sophie stood in the middle of the living room, small and fragile, her hands clutching her toy as though it could shield her. Her parents faced each other, words flung like daggers piercing the air. She screamed for them to stop, but her voice broke, lost in the roar of their anger. Her chest heaved, and tears streamed unchecked down her cheeks. For the first time, she let her pain escape, loud and raw, filling the silence they had left her in for too long. She screamed until her throat burned, until the house itself seemed to tremble with her sorrow. Her mother froze mid-sentence, eyes wide, her voice caught in her throat. Her father turned, his face paling as Sophie's cry shattered the moment. For once their anger paused, replaced by shock at the depth of her pain. Sophie's body shook, her small voice breaking into sobs, words tumbling out, pleas for them to stop, to love, to remember her. Each sob ripped through the room like a wound reopening. They saw her not as background, but as the very soul they had scarred. But it was too late. Her voice was not enough to fix what they had already destroyed. Sophie collapsed onto her knees, sobs shaking her fragile frame. Her small hands clutched at the floor, as if she could anchor herself to something unbroken. Her mother stepped forward, reaching for her, but Sophie pulled away, her eyes filled with betrayal. Her father bent slightly, words forming but never reaching air. The silence that followed was unbearable, filled only with Sophie's broken cries. She looked at them both, her pain raw and unfiltered, and for the first time they seemed powerless, their anger silenced by the truth in her tears. Her mother finally fell to her knees beside her, arms outstretched but uncertain, as though afraid Sophie would break further under her touch. Her father stepped closer, his hands trembling at his sides. Sophie lifted her head, her tear-soaked eyes burning with anger and sorrow. She cried out, demanding why, demanding how they could tear apart the only home she had ever known. Her words were jagged, broken, but they carried more weight than anything her parents had said. She was no longer just a child in the background. She was the voice of their shattered family. Her sobs slowed, leaving only shivers running through her small body. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, the world blurred but painfully clear. Her parents hovered, broken and silent, realizing the cost of their war. Sophie whispered softly, her voice almost gone, that she just wanted them to love again. The room fell still, heavy with the truth they had ignored. She curled into herself, exhausted, her childhood finally gone. The silence that followed was not peace, it was surrender. And in that surrender, Sophie understood she was alone, even in their presence. The house was quiet again, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence after a storm, heavy, lingering, filled with debris of words that could not be taken back. Sophie sat on her bed, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest, her small body aching from sobs that had left her voice raw. She stared at the ceiling, searching for patterns in the cracks, as if they could give her the answers her parents never could. Her tears had dried, but her heart still wept, and the hollow ache inside her seemed endless. She whispered into the shadows, asking if love was supposed to hurt this way, but no answer came. Only the weight of emptiness remained, pressing down like the night sky itself. Her mother entered quietly, her steps hesitant, her eyes swollen and red from tears that refused to end. She sat on the edge of the bed, reaching a hand toward Sophie, but stopped midway, as if afraid the touch might shatter her further. Sophie turned slightly, her eyes meeting her mother's for only a moment before drifting away. She wanted comfort, but trust felt like glass, too fragile to hold. Her mother whispered something soft, a promise she no longer believed, words meant to soothe, but empty against the weight of what had been broken. Sophie closed her eyes, wishing she could believe again, wishing she could feel safe. But even in her mother's presence, she felt alone. The morning came, but it did not bring light. The sun rose behind heavy clouds, casting a gray pall over everything. Sophie sat at the window, knees pulled to her chest, watching raindrops streak down the glass. Each droplet mirrored the tears she had shed, small pieces of sorrow sliding away, but never truly gone. She thought of the laughter she used to hear in the mornings, the warmth of voices that once filled the kitchen. Now, the house echoed only with silence. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her breath fogging the pain, and whispered to herself that she would find a way to survive this, even if survival meant learning how to live in the emptiness. Her father entered the room quietly, his footsteps soft, his presence heavy with guilt. He tried to speak, but words seemed stuck, choking in his throat. Sophie turned to look at him, her small eyes carrying more weight than a child should ever hold. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small trinket, a charm from her childhood, something he thought might bridge the distance. Sophie stared at it, her hands trembling as she took it. But the gesture felt hollow, a reminder of promises already broken. She nodded faintly, but her silence spoke louder than rejection. Her father sighed deeply, shoulders sagging, realizing he could not undo what had been done. The day stretched long, but Sophie felt suspended in time, trapped between what had been and what would never be again. Her parents moved around her carefully, their voices softer now, but the cracks between them showed in every glance. Sophie sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched plate, the fork cold in her hand. She wondered if life would always feel like this, broken, hollow, incomplete. She whispered to herself that she would have to grow stronger, even if it meant growing alone. For the first time, she felt the beginning of something heavy settle in her chest, the knowledge that innocence was gone, and she would have to find her way without it. The night crept in again, shadows stretching long across the floor. Sophie lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her chin. She listened to the house, its silence now familiar, each creak and sigh a reminder of how much had changed. She felt older, heavier, though her body was still small. She whispered into the darkness, a question no one would answer. Could love return, or was it gone forever? The room gave no reply, only the hollow echo of her voice. Her heart ached, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps strength, perhaps only resignation. She closed her eyes, letting the silence hold her one last time. She dreamed of laughter, of warm days in the park, of her parents holding her hands as if nothing could ever break them apart. But even in the dream, the laughter echoed strangely, fading before it reached her. Sophie woke with tears on her cheeks, the ache of loss sharper for the memory of what once was. She curled tighter beneath her blanket, clutching the toy closer, whispering to herself that she would remember those good days, even if they never returned. Memory would have to be her anchor, even as the present unraveled around her. The morning came with muted light, soft and gray, casting a pale glow across her face. Sophie rose slowly, her movements weary, as if carrying years beyond her age. She walked to the mirror, standing on tiptoe to see herself. The reflection that stared back looked the same, but she knew it wasn't. Behind her eyes was something changed, something gone forever. She pressed her small hand against the glass, whispering that she would survive, even if she had to do it alone. The girl in the mirror looked back silently, carrying the same promise. Childhood had slipped away, and what remained was fragile resilience. She stepped into the living room, where her parents sat apart, quiet, their faces heavy with what they could not fix. Sophie moved past them, her small steps steady, her eyes distant but clear. She didn't ask questions anymore, didn't beg for promises. She simply carried herself with the quiet strength born of heartbreak. The silence that followed her was different now, not just absence, but acknowledgement. Her parents looked at her, perhaps realizing the cost of their choices, but Sophie did not linger on their gaze. She had learned that love could vanish, and in its absence she would have to stand. That night, Sophie stood at the window, gazing into the vast darkness. The stars were hidden behind clouds, but she searched for them anyway, refusing to believe they were gone. She whispered softly, promising herself she would carry on, even if no one carried her. The world outside moved forward, uncaring, but she stood there, small and unbroken, holding the last piece of her childhood close. The final tear slipped down her cheek, warm against the cold night. She whispered a vow that she would endure, even if it meant growing too soon. The silence embraced her, final and endless, but she did not look away.